Okay, so it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Courtenary Norbury from UCL, and she's going to be giving a talk entitled Stability and Change in Developmental Language Disorder.
Okay, so, well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. I know we're all Zoom weary coming into December, but it's nice to be here. I don't think I've, apart from teaching, haven't given a proper talk in ages, so I might be a bit rusty, but let's see how this goes. And I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see that. Okay, so I'm going to start by thanking people. Scales is a huge project. It's been going on for a decade now. I can barely believe that, but indeed it's been going on for a long time. And there's a lot of people involved. So the original grant was a collaboration with Gillian Baird, Tony Charman, Emily Simonoff, and Andrew Pickles. And Debbie Gooch was the first postdoc who worked on the first wave and did amazing work with us. And then Sarah has been working with me since 2018, and she is completely amazing. And a lot of what you'll see today has been things that we've been doing together, and I really appreciate her input. And then we've collected huge amounts of data, and the people in the pictures below are the people who collected all of that data, and I am indebted to them. This is the most recent team. You can see we had a socially distanced picnic this summer. The last time I saw them all face to face, that was in July, but we've managed to keep talking on Zoom and keep our spirits up in this very strange time. So I am hugely grateful to all of them. What I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of a very brief background on language disorders and what motivated this study. And then I'm going to tell you about scales. And the main things I'm going to talk about are prevalence, persistence, and progress. And then at the end, I'm going to give you my "if I ruled the world, here's what I would think about" kind of sentences about what I think this all means. And it has raised some challenges for me and changed my thinking quite a bit, but that's what science is for, right? Okay, so let's start with developmental language disorder. So this is DSM-5 criteria. Basically, we're looking at children for whom language abilities are below the chronological age expectations, where language deficits are not explained by other developmental conditions, although I always point out that language impairment is frequently characteristic of all of these other developmental conditions. And the language impairment should be sufficient to interfere with everyday life at home or at school. And I put some things in red because this is where we have very little consensus or clarification about what the limits are. And that's led to quite a confusing picture in the field. We know that language disorder has long-term functional impacts. So when children start school, language deficits can be associated with problems acquiring literacy skills and academic underachievement. Even early on, language disorders can be associated with problem behaviors and difficulties with peer relationships. And as young people become young adults, we know that there's problems with employment, gaining employment, maintaining employment, and increased risk for poor mental health. So a lot of people have started thinking about language disorder as a public health issue, given all of these negative consequences that children might experience if language disorders are not resolved. So we know from a lot of work, when I first started in the field, I had the great privilege of working with Dorothy Bishop, and the first study that I worked on was a twin study. I went all over the UK testing young twins for language skills. And a lot of work that Dorothy and other people have done have demonstrated fairly conclusively that there is a biological basis to language disorders. We know that language disorder runs in families. Twin studies have shown that many language traits are heritable. So monozygotic twins look more similar to one another than dizygotic twins. And there's been a lot of work in recent years trying to isolate specific genetic effects This isn't easy, and it looks like many genes are contributing small amounts of variation to language profiles. And this is very similar for lots of neurodevelopmental conditions. The story is the same. And if you want to read an accessible review, this one's getting a bit old, but Diane Newbury writes beautifully, so you can have an overview of the thinking there. Of course, what genes do is affect the way the brain develops. There aren't as many brain imaging studies of children with language disorders as there might be in other developmental conditions, but Kate Watkins and Saloni Krishnan have been working on a very big study in Oxford on this, and I think they're due to report their results shortly. But again, this is an accessible review, thinking about the development, not just of language regions in the brain, but of neural systems that are involved in learning generally. And this has been quite an interesting development because it speaks not just to the language difficulties that these children have, but with the broader profile of developmental challenges that we often see in DLD. So we live in interesting times, that's for sure. If you're interested in language disorder, it has been particularly interesting. The field has been confused for a long time. Many different terms have been used. Public awareness of the disorder is poor. And many years ago now, I was involved with some wonderful people, including Dorothy, Gina Conti-Ramsden, Maggie Snowling, and a speech and language therapist called Becky Clark. And we decided that we wanted to raise awareness of this condition and the consequences that it has for young people. So we started the Rattled campaign, and we had a YouTube channel, which has taken off. It's developed a life of its own, and it's very exciting to see. But one of the missions that we had was to try and get some traction on terminology and variation in diagnostic criteria. And Dorothy really took this work forward through the Catalyze Consortium, which published 2 influential papers a few years ago, where we got international agreement on a couple of really important things. So the first was terminology, and the Catalyze Consortium agreed that instead of specific language impairment, we should use the term developmental language disorder, or DLD, for those cases where language is not developing as expected, but there's no other condition that might be causally influencing that language profile. That's not without controversy, but actually most people have taken that on board, and it's been really useful in terms of our public awareness campaigns. And we now even have an International DLD Day in October, which is more and more popular every year, and really some fantastic work coming through that. We also looked at diagnostic criteria, and I'm flagging the kind of most controversial things here. But one of the consensus statements was that diagnostic criteria should not reference nonverbal cognitive ability. What diagnosis does require is evidence of poor prognosis, and that has some implications for the age at which we might want to provide a diagnosis. And also this idea that very early in development, there's lots of movement in child language. And so we need to have multiple measures before we can confirm an actual diagnosis of DLD. And in our diagnostic criteria, we've tried very hard to move away from exclusionary criteria. But what Catalyze does is distinguish between differentiating conditions, risk factors, and co-occurring conditions. So in this graphic, what I'm showing you is that we recognize that many children have language disorders. Very often, these language disorders are associated with biomedical conditions. So in a previous life, I did an awful lot of work on the overlap in language disorders between children who have more DLD type profiles and children with autism. We say associated on purpose because there's questions about what causes what, but that's distinguished from children with DLD, who are a subset of this larger group, But these are children for whom at the moment their language difficulties are unexplained. They don't have any other conditions like autism or Down syndrome. They might have risk factors though, and they might have co-occurring issues with things like attention or motor skills or particularly literacy problems. But this will be important for understanding scales. So this has been really exciting development in the field. And the interesting bit for me was that this was happening while scales was happening. So scales was a really nice opportunity to see how these changes in diagnostic criteria played out in a population sample of children where we were tracking their language development anyway. So SCALE stands for the Surrey Communication and Language in Education Study. So here's a map. It's kind of south and west of London. All of these blue dots are schools. We had over 180 primary schools taking part. And one of the things we've been able to look at in scales is the impact of these changes to diagnostic criteria on prevalence and profiles of language disorder. And then we've been tracking their development over time and looking at the impact of these language profiles on broader developmental and academic skills. So we've got 5 waves of data collection here. So we started when they were in reception, and we screened 7,267 children in state-maintained schools in Surrey. Most of the screening was in the summer term of that first reception year when the children were aged 4 and 5. I'm just going to report the monolingual subsamples today, but we had 529 monolingual children that we assessed in year 1, and then we saw 499 of them again in year 3. This marks a change in funder. So this bit of the study was funded by Wellcome. This bit has been funded by the ESRC. We saw the children again in year 6, and then we tried to see them again last year when they were in year 8. They're now in year 9. The numbers drop off. So here are the challenges of doing a longitudinal study. This is the year that GDPR came in. So trying to track children using personal information became an awful lot harder. And Surrey, who have been absolutely brilliant throughout, got a little bit more nervous about helping us track children around Surrey. So the numbers dropped a bit there. And then last year, of course, we got halfway through data collection and all the schools closed. So our target for last year was 391 children. And this is how it breaks down in terms of typical language and DLD. We managed to get through 190 of them before schools closed. And we had we'd seen about half of the typical language kids and about half of the kids with language disorder. We tried to move everything online to see how many of them we could visit during the school closures, during lockdown. And we managed to see 49 children, which frankly was more than we thought we might be able to do. But you can see that there's real bias here in who takes part. So not surprisingly, it's much harder to get families of children where there's severe language disorders to take part in online assessments, and there's also SES differences in who takes part as well. So there are a lot of children that we couldn't see, but we managed to see 239 of them. All things considered, that's not so bad. And it's been a huge test battery. We have questionnaire data from parents, teachers, and the children themselves, standardized assessments of language and cognitive ability, and some experimental tasks as well. Okay, so at time 1, we wanted to screen children for language and communication risk. We bought teachers out of teaching for a day, so they completed questionnaires for all the children in the classroom, which is a big ask. And we asked them to do a short form of the children's communication checklist. That was the main measure. We asked them to do the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, and we asked them to complete the new, at that time new, early years foundation stage profile for us, which gives a teacher rating of some early learning goals. This is just a flow chart showing you how many children took part at this stage. We also asked them for some background information about ethnicity, home language, their current special educational needs status, and teacher concern. So at the screening stage, all children were between 4'9" and 5'10". We had a pretty equal gender split. Our ethnicity was pretty representative of the UK. 11% had English as an additional language, which was a little bit lower than the UK total. I had a PhD student, Katie Whiteside, who has reported some of the data on the EAL children, so I won't talk about them too much today. If you know anything about Surrey, you know that it's fairly affluent. We did that on purpose, not just because Surrey were willing to do this, but also we wanted to look at language disorder rather than just what some people consider to be maybe environmentally influenced language difficulties. So our data are skewed in terms of affluence, but we do have representation from across the SES spectrum, and that's important. Here is the CCC data. So the scores on this measure go from 0 to 39. 39 basically means the child had no phrase speech. So the first item asks, is the child combining words into phrases or sentences? And if teacher said no, the children got a score of 39. I think the dark bars are the boys and the light bars are the girls. And we basically took a cutoff at about the 14th centile. And when you do this, you find much higher percentage of boys to girls, a much higher percentage of summer-born children, and a much higher percentage of children who have English as an additional language. And if you look at their scores on the early years foundation stage profile, only fewer than 10% of children who fell into this category were achieving all of their early learning goals. This is new data. We've just submitted the paper where we're looking at social gradients in identification of language disorders. So what we're plotting here are the Adaki rank quintiles. This is the midpoint in the quintiles. So these are the most affluent quintiles to the most impoverished quintile, boys here and girls here. So again, you can see very clear gender differences in how teachers are reporting children's language competence. And you can see this very steep rise from a percentage here of about 5% of girls to about 12%, and for boys it's much higher. So clear social gradients in teacher ratings of language competence at the end of the first year of school. So we had a stratified subsample that we wanted to see for in-depth assessment. We did a very comprehensive battery of language and cognitive ability. We identified children as having language disorder if they scored 1.5 standard deviations below the mean on 2 out of our 5 language composites, which is consistent with previous epidemiological studies in terms of the number of composites that you think of. Our language criteria are more severe, but we varied the nonverbal criteria. So Bruce Tomlin has the most famous epidemiological study. His language criteria were less severe, and he only included children who had nonverbal IQs above 87, whereas we were more inclusive. We get similar estimates, though, for language disorder, and it breaks down like this. So by including children with lower nonverbal IQ, we increase our prevalence estimate by about 50%. These are children who have those associated conditions. So they're a really mixed bag of children. Some of them have known genetic conditions. Some of them have autism. Some of them have broader intellectual disabilities. They make up another 2.3%. So in state maintained schools, the total prevalence estimate is just under 10%. And of course, there'll be a very small percentage of children who are already in schools for children with significant learning needs. So about 10% of the population meet these criteria for language disorder with varying cognitive profiles. And this has big impacts on their academic learning. So only about 10% meet their early learning goals. Now, what we wanted to do was to say, does this variation in IQ qualitatively change the profile of children that we're identifying? So here what I'm doing is I'm comparing the children who might have been considered to have a specific language impairment to those who had broader nonverbal IQ scores. So we're including the ones who are falling between 70 and 85 standard scores. And then these are the children who have associated developmental conditions like autism or Down syndrome. And we've compared them on a DACI rank. This, well, I should just say, between these two groups, there's no difference on any index. But as I've said, these both groups will come from more impoverished neighborhoods. They don't differ on the original children's communication checklist. They don't differ significantly on the severity of their overall language composite scores. The percentage of children who are presenting with significant social, emotional, and behavioral problems is about double what we saw in the children who don't have language difficulties. But again, this IQ difference doesn't matter here. And their raw scores on the early years foundation stage profile aren't different. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter at all, because you can see that basically children who have an associated condition have more severe difficulties across the board, and about half of them have these significant behavioral difficulties. So this really kind of supports the catalyzed conceptualization of what language disorder looks like, and supports that change in the extent to which we should consider nonverbal IQ as part of the diagnosis. It's useful, potentially useful information in helping us to understand maybe response to treatment later down the line. But in terms of the quality of language profile, it doesn't seem to make much difference unless it's part of a broader developmental condition. Okay, so then we've looked at these children over time, and I can say that language development is characterized by huge variation. At every age we've assessed them, stability, but also growth in language skills. So here's just a couple of examples that we've pulled out. This is expressive vocabulary. This is a narrative comprehension task. All the triangles are children. This is year 1, year 3, and year 6. And basically what you can see is our scores range from floor to ceiling on every measure at every time point. And that is true of all the language measures and all the literacy measures that we've done as well. So just huge individual differences. Language is also incredibly stable. So what I'm showing you here is the total language composite Z score in year 1, plotted against the same language composite Z score in year 3. I've marked the cutoffs here, so minus 1.5 standard, minus 1.5 standard deviations at each time point. And the interclass correlation coefficient here is 0.95. So if it was a perfect relationship, it would be 1. And it's pretty close over this 2-year period. Very stable indeed. And that is consistent with a lot of work that's come out during the time that we've been doing scales. So Mark Bornstein NIH in the States has been looking at language stability in the general population using different measures at different ages and different informants, in children at increased biological or social risk, and in children who have contrasting language skills, even if all of them come from disadvantaged communities, the story is the same. Language is very, very stable. If you're being very eagle-eyed though, you say, but hang on a second, there's some children who've crossed the boundary here, so they look like they're doing better in year 3 than they were doing in year 1. This is matched by those who look like they might be doing worse. So this is really getting at diagnostic instability, which we know is an issue, and we think this is largely due to measurement error and regression to the mean. They're not perfect measures. And another reason to think that is some work that's been done in Australia. So this is a paper by Christina McKean, who's looking at the ELVS cohort. They used a statistical technique that accounts for that measurement error, where they just looked at latent growth profiles, and 94% of their population sample had stable language growth trajectories. Only 2% of children showed a trajectory that started low and showed real improvement, and half of them had English as an additional language. So only about 1% of children in that population were showing significant improvement over time that changed their language trajectory. So at this point, usually everybody gets very depressed. I don't want you to get depressed, because actually, even though language is stable, it is changing and it is improving. So these are some new data where we're showing, again, vocabulary here, and we're showing sentence repetition in this graph. The red lines are the typical language kids, and the black lines are the children who have language difficulties or were identified as having language disorder when they started school. And you can see that all of these lines are going in an upward trajectory. And interestingly for me, the rate of change is the same. So this has puzzled me quite a lot. I'm not really sure what it means, but I think it's really impressively good news that these children who start school with significant language difficulties, and many of them have additional concerns, nevertheless make huge progress in language, and the rate of progress is parallel to what you see in typically developing children. And what I'm going to do is zoom in on this period of time so you can see better what that means. Here we've split that language group again into those with DLD and those who have associated conditions. The confidence intervals are bigger here because there's fewer children in this group. But again, you can see that the rate of improvement is similar to typical peers, even though these are kids who have multiple developmental challenges. That's the good news. The tricky news is that if you look at the difference, this line is the median age in year 3, and this is year 1. So you can see that these children with language disorders come to year 3, where the typical kids were in year 1. So that's a 2-year language gap. And given that that rate of change seems to be pretty consistent over time, that means that 2-year gap is there all the way through primary school. So how can language be characterized by both change and stability? Well, the way I started thinking about this is where working with Gillian Baird, who's a pediatrician, can be helpful, because when we looked at those graphs, she said, that looks like a height and weight chart. And that's really influenced the way I've thought about it ever since. So basically, if we think about height, we can measure a child at 4, and we can measure them every year throughout primary school. And it's basically a linear pattern of growth over that period of time. Kids get taller, unless something terrible happens, but on the whole, they get taller. And that's growth, individual development on a characteristic over time. Stability refers to your position within a distribution. So if we get a class of 4-year-olds and we ask them to line up in order of height, there will be some children who are relatively shorter and some children who are relatively taller. If we measure the whole class again in year 6, they're all taller, but this person is probably still at the bottom of the distribution, and this person is probably still the tallest child in the class. And there might be a little bit of variation in the middle, but essentially that rank order is preserved. And that seems to be the way that language is behaving. So if we think, if we take this a little bit further and think that language behaves like height or weight or other developmental characteristics, we can see that they're both distributed within the population, usually in some kind of normal distribution. We have, frankly, arbitrary cutoffs for extreme scores. So I liked this graph that I found where you have average height, kind of tall, tall, or extremely tall, which is usually based on your distance from the mean. Height is highly heritable. So tall parents tend to have tall kids. Height is also highly stable. Interestingly though, height is ultimately subject to environmental influences. And you might think, how can that be? But if you look over time, changes in environmental factors, particularly nutrition, access to medical care, has led to people becoming taller. So this was a study published a few years ago where they looked at the average heights across different nations in 1914 and in 2014. And in general, we're all getting taller. Nevertheless, there are relative differences. So the tallest men apparently live in the Netherlands. But you can also find countries that have relatively shorter people, even though everybody's getting taller. And the biggest change in height for men was in Iran. So even things like height are changeable under the right environmental circumstances. So what factors might maintain or disrupt stability? So there's a number of different things we can look at, and we've tried to look at many of them in scales. Where we haven't been able to, I've got some other data for you. So one of the things that is most interesting and most maybe challenging for thinking about what we do next are developmental changes. So this is data from Mark Bornstein's group. He's producing here stability estimates for children with average to high language skills at the end of the study versus those who have language deficits. And basically the most notable thing that he's found across many, many studies is that there is a change in stability, where stability estimates from early toddlerhood to 5 years old are actually fairly weak. But then once you get to school, they become very, very strong indeed. And he and other people have suggested that maybe this indicates a developmental period in which the brain is more plastic and more open to environmental influences that could change a developmental trajectory. However, methodological issues also matter. So if you look here, for preschoolers, we rely heavily on parent reports of language, and the reliability of instruments that test language in very young children is not necessarily as good as it is for older children. Here you have more direct measures and you have very reliable and robust measures. So it might be that that change in stability is driven largely by changes in the measures that we're using. So stability estimates increase when our measures are reliable, when we use the same measures at each test point, like we've done in scales, which contributes to that really high level of stability. When respondents are the same, so if you ask parents over time, you tend to have stronger stability estimates than if you ask teachers, because the teachers change at every test point. And when the time between tests is quite short. So some of that developmental change in stability might reflect the changes in the measures that we're using. There are also child level factors that might contribute to stability and change, because stable child characteristics shape the development of later characteristics. And if we think about how the kind of things about children that change their environments, we know, for example, that by year 3, many of the children who had these associated conditions, so the ones that are represented by the green line, were in different sorts of classrooms. So even though they almost all start off in mainstream primary school classrooms, by year 3, many of those children with associated classrooms were in special provision. And that changes what they're learning and how they're learning. Many of them have problems with peers, so they don't have the same sort of peer interactions that typical kids are having that also influence language development. They have lots of problems with reading and with learning. And this is particularly problematic because as we get older, much of what we need to learn comes from books. So if you can't read, then the nature of what you're learning is going to be quite different too. So we tried to look at some child level factors that might influence stability. And what we were able to do is to say, well, does the child's nonverbal cognitive skills influence rate of language growth, or does their early behavioral difficulties influence rate of growth? And our findings are consistent again with Mark Bornstein's work, and that we show both are associated with the starting level, with the intercept, such that children with the most severe language difficulties also tend to have lower nonverbal ability scores and also tend to have more severe behavior problems, but neither predicts change, neither predicts the slope. So having low scores on a nonverbal IQ test doesn't slow your rate of language learning over time, which I think is fascinating. The other thing we might want to look at is family level factors. So there's an awful lot of research demonstrating that parental input is associated with individual differences in language and language growth. But I would emphasize that the causal relationships here are complex. So I know a lot of people, particularly in the general public, would like to say that the reason that children have language difficulties is because parents don't talk to them. But it's a lot more complicated than that. So remember, there are biological factors. It runs in families, not all, but many parents who have children with language difficulties may themselves have difficulties with language and literacy. Communication is also a two-way street. So the reason I put this in here is that this child is engaging in behaviors that prompt parent language. And if you have a child with language disorder who's not doing this, the opportunities for parents to provide that language input might be reduced as well. So they're associated, but the situation is complex. Now, it's difficult in a population study to measure this kind of interaction in any detail. So the proxy that people often use is income or SES. We had Idaki rank scores, so we were able to say, well, does neighborhood deprivation associate with growth? I've shown you that it does associate with identification of disorder, but it doesn't predict growth in any way. So it's not the case, again, that children from lower SES backgrounds have slower rates of growth. It didn't predict in our study rates of growth, and it doesn't predict stability estimates in any of Mark Bornstein's studies either. So all of the interaction, all of the exciting stuff is happening at the intercept. Nothing we've seen so far helps us understand rate of language growth. And then finally, we have contextual factors. I think our data are a real testament to the power of universal, free, and generally high quality education. School provides more consistent and equitable language input to children, And I think that one of the reasons that we have such high stability after school entry is because of that more homogeneous language learning environment that schools provide. Now, the only study that I know of that demonstrates slower rates of growth in children who have language difficulties is a study that was published last year by Anne Lervag and Monica Melby-Lervag, who are in Oslo. And they were looking at Roma children who had significant language difficulties relative to the mainstream community. But that slower rate of growth was completely mediated by school absence and lower nonverbal abilities. So in that community, children had more school absences and they dropped out of school earlier. And this was associated with a slower rate of growth relative to peers. So we need more studies, but certainly it would seem that in our society where most children are in school most of the time, school is really going to support that language stability. So all of this raises a really interesting question about whether it is possible to change a language trajectory. And I would say that I'm having done this study and read a lot of stuff about intervention, I'm not so sure we can do that anymore. I think it's a really, really hard thing to do, especially once kids get to school. And one of the reasons I think it's so hard is that you need to accelerate language learning in a group for whom we know have biological and very often environmental challenges to language learning. And I think trying to make that happen in a typical classroom is a big ask. What I think we might be able to do is narrow the distribution. And if we want to do that, then I would definitely emphasize early intervention, particularly nursery age, because it certainly seems from our data that the level of language someone has when they start school is hugely predictive of where they end up. So if you can raise that bar, then that will give them an advantage. I don't think this is going to be easy though. So the best evidence we have for intervention are quite intensive interventions that go on for a long time. There's just no quick way around it. And even if we do that, and we do it very well, there's always going to be a gap. There will be children at the bottom of the intervention, at the distribution. And so I don't think that changing a trajectory should be the only goal of intervention. I also think it's not reasonable to expect that children will be in therapy or receiving special language groups or whatever forever. So I've started to think, is there a way to stack your provision at particular points that might be challenging? So entry to school, I think, is really important. When children make that transition to literacy, extra support might be really important. If you ask parents, they say going to secondary school was the point at which everything fell apart. I think that's because both social situations and the language you need to navigate them become more tricky. The language for academic success becomes more complex and more abstract. And I think at this point, children also seem to become a little bit more aware of the differences between them and maybe some of their peers. So extra support at secondary schools would seem to be very important. And then because we know that children don't grow out of these difficulties, support for adult life and the transition to work is key. And we have very little research on what that would look like and what would be most helpful. And the other thing is, I think we've got into this situation where a lot of therapy services feel pressure to get kids off their books. And that leads us to not spend so much time with children that we know have very limited language. And I think that's unfortunate because I think all children have the right to be able to communicate in a functional way with peers and family and at school. So whatever we do, we should ensure that those children at the bottom of the distribution have functional levels of language. And I think that evaluating the outcome of intervention in terms of standardized language tests has some serious limitations, and looking at developing language that will allow children to do particular things like integrate with peers, to develop their own emotion and behavioral regulation skills, to focus on well-being might be a more useful way to evaluate the success of an intervention. So I've started thinking about improving language outcomes a bit like improving fitness. So if you know me, you know that I'm not built like a runner. There are genetic reasons why that is the case. My parents certainly weren't runners and didn't provide that kind of running environment for me. But I do recognize that running is a good thing to do for my health, but I'm not very good at it. This is from the beginning of lockdown. So I ran a 5K in 51 minutes. I'm pleased to say that with a lot of training, that time has come down to 40 minutes since lockdown began, but it is not easy, okay? There's no way I could do a 6-week intensive running intervention and be sorted. I have to do it 2 times a week, every week, without fail, otherwise we get nowhere. But it does make a difference. However, I can tell you that if I stopped running tomorrow, that time would go straight back up again. Yeah, it wouldn't be maintained over the longer term. And that certainly seems to be the way that language interventions work. So we do short-term interventions, children improve on some skills, we leave it for a while, and those intervention effects tend to wash out. There's no quick fix. One thing I would say is that what makes it harder as I go on is it's hard and I don't like doing it. So eventually I want to find an alternative where I can get the same sort of benefits, but it's not something that I really hate doing. And I think this is also something to think about when we're working with, particularly with adolescents, that it is important to focus on those things that they need to be able to do to be successful in life. But we also want to give them workarounds, strategies that will enable them to be successful, that don't rely so much on the things that they find particularly difficult. Right, so just to conclude, my big take-home messages are that language development is characterized by huge variation and individual differences, very strong stability, but growth and improvement in language skills. All children make progress in language and learning, and this is very positive news, but narrowing those language gaps is hugely challenging. There are no fixes for improving language outcomes. I do think early intervention is important, but the idea that we can do early intervention and that will mean we don't need services later on just really isn't correct, and we need to be honest about that, I think. And because of that, I feel that the goal of intervention should not be cure, but we should really think about how we can optimize communication and learning outcomes and promote well-being for young people who are going to have continuing language needs, probably throughout their lifetimes. So I just want to say thank you to a few people. I would have to say that we could not have done this without huge support from Surrey. These 2 women, Virginia and Jennifer, they really got the ball rolling and got Surrey to buy in. They've both retired now. We've been doing this for so long. They've both retired now, but I do appreciate their input. And these lovely women took over, Wendy, Cheryl, and Barbara. We ran a discussion for DLD Day, and you can link to that there. And I would encourage you to do that. This is Sophie Frank. She's an adult with DLD, and she had some fascinating things to say about how she manages her language and communication in adulthood and the impact that it's had. Obviously, we want to thank our funders and all the schools and the kids who took part and have provided us with such an incredibly rich data set. And thanks to all of you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Courtney. Could I get you to stop sharing your screen and then we'll open up for questions? Who would like to start? Katie, could you unmute yourself?
I can, and I'll lower my hand. That is an absolutely incredible project. So thank you for doing it. I was wondering, given what you've learned over the years on scales, what you think the mechanisms are underlying DLD. So do you think it might be kind of I mean, what are these kids doing differently to kids who don't have DLD? Is it like a processing thing, or can it be attributed to one kind of cognitive mechanism that's kind of isolatable? Or how much variability do you think there is between children with this diagnosis on? I suppose you've got the answer to that in scales, actually.
We don't have the answer to that in scales. It's a great question. I think there's probably lots of different things going on. So like any condition like autism or ADHD, we give kids the label because they have similar patterns of behavior or challenge. But I think there's probably lots of different things going on underlying that. The thing that has really perplexed me the most is this parallel rate of language growth. And even in Mark Bornstein's work, he says, you know, whatever the mechanisms are, they seem to be similar wherever you are in the distribution. And that I find difficult to reconcile with the fact that they have language difficulties. If their rate of learning was the same, then you would say, well, why is there such a huge difference? I do think it's something to do with learning. I think you need different data to what we've collected in scale. So certainly, like I said, Kate Watkins and Saloni, they've been doing some neuroimaging and looking at learning tasks in the scanner and basic structural differences and all kinds of stuff. So that might give us some indications. It's a really tricky one, and I'm afraid I don't have a good answer.
There'll be lots of exciting research into it in the future. So
yeah, absolutely. What I would say is, I think you know, if you think of intervention as structuring, I think of it in two parts. One is structuring in the environment in a way that will make the things you want kids to learn more optimally clear, and you're giving kids more practice to do it. And I think whatever's going on, that's what they need.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Patrick first, could I get you to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi Courtney, thanks very much. That was a fantastic presentation. Shame we can't clap properly to thank you. Yeah, I was thinking too about, you know, relating this language growth to other sort of public health measures, and yeah, my view is similar to yours, that schools must be doing an extraordinary job in ensuring the gap doesn't widen, actually.
Yeah.
But what is really peculiar in the school age data is that you don't get any effects of particular pressure points in terms of the development of literacy. So you would have thought that this language composite measure, and I presume it's mainly around oral vocabulary comprehension.
Yeah.
Those ought to be strongly predictive of literacy development as well. And you would have thought that if you have poor language and poor literacy, then the combination of those should be really exacerbate the possibilities for language development, especially as children go through their education, they learn more and more words from reading rather than from listening. So I'm wondering what you feel about this, why we don't see any sort of discontinuities in terms of the language development as children go through those stages of literacy.
Yeah, so I so you're like, it's like you're reading my to-do list, Patrick. And the next thing on it is to look specifically at literacy, and we have started mapping that out. And what I would say is that I think we are going to see that, and I think it's in the year 8 data. So certainly things are looking a little bit different when we start looking at what happens when they go into secondary school. And I think maybe part of that is just, I don't know, it's a lot of, I think what I've learned to appreciate more is that a lot of this has to do with the measures that you choose. And so I just think that in the vocabulary task that we have, maybe it's not as sensitive to that kind of thing as some other measures might be. Certainly in terms of word reading, the very initial analyses we've done, and I wouldn't want you to quote me on this, but certainly it looks like those lines start to diverge. So the typical kids are continuing to go in a linear direction, and the kids with language disorders are not. And I would guess that when we marry that to their vocabulary data, you might start to see some gaps emerging.
Right, but in the Bornstein data, I mean, that goes up to age 11, right? And
yeah,
and the graphs you showed of his work didn't seem to show any discontinuities there.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. That's true. And actually, now that you mention it, I'm thinking Weichmann studies looking at vocabulary tend to show parallel rates of growth all the way to adulthood. So, yeah, one to ponder.
Okay, I will as well. Thanks very much.
I have to ponder that a bit. I have to ponder that a bit more. But again, I do think some of it is about measurement. And I guess maybe there are workarounds. If you can't read, maybe they're learning in different ways, at least the sorts of things that we might be tapping. But yeah, I think it's a puzzle. But I do think we might see some differences in particular tasks when they get into secondary school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Margaret, you've got your hand up. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I had similar kind of thoughts as Patrick already asked about, but I think it kind of feeds into the discussion of Matthew effects. And I read a paper recently by Kemper et al. About that, and they looked for Matthew effects, as in the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And they couldn't find any in, for instance, word level reading or more basic skills, but they did find some in reading comprehension and vocabulary, but it is later. So I wouldn't be at all surprised, as you say, Courtney, that it might be kind of, you might see this a little later rather than earlier on. The other thing that I was thinking, your story about stability and saying, can we really change this trajectory, does sound a little bit depressing to me. And I wondered whether it is because you think it is not feasible to do the kind of intensive work that would be necessary to change the trajectory on a large scale, or whether it is literally impossible. Because with kids with dyslexia that we followed in the Netherlands longitudinally, we did see that they started catching up when they did like a year-long, very high intensity intervention, and then things started to kind of level off when that intervention stopped. So similar story there, but yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
It's a really good question. So you're right that so there's two things that might be possible. There might be a sensitive period in which it is possible, and we just haven't hit on it. And partly I think that's because you might need to do that before you even realize that they've got such significant problems, and that raises another whole host of issues, and that's incredibly speculative. I don't know if you can do that, but the potential is there. So if you get them early enough and you train them up in a way that's influencing the way the brain then develops, maybe you could alter that trajectory. The other possibility is, like you say, if I wanted to make a big policy decision, what I would do is improve access to high quality nursery provision, particularly in areas of disadvantage, which would scoop up most of them and I hope would give them the best opportunities for improving their language skills. Of course, other countries have done that and tried to do that. And there's lots of variation in outcomes, but it's not necessarily the fix that we might hope that it would be. The other thing is, as you say, really intensive intervention for those kids at the bottom of the distribution. My guess is, as you say, that would make a big difference, but once you stop doing it, it would wash out. And that's why I think the kind of weight thing is interesting when you think about other public health issues. We know that diet can help you lose weight, but if you're someone like me that has that genetic propensity to have to work really hard at it, the minute you stop doing it, you just revert back to your normal trajectory. And unfortunately, I think that is the way that language is. So if we want to have sustained improvement over time, then we have to sustain the kind of environmental supports that help kids learn. And that's a tricky one.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have a question for Courtney? I've got Julian. Can you unmute yourself, please?
I just wanted to explore a slightly different way of thinking about the stability thing, because it does seem to me it's really quite surprising that it's so stable, or at least that the gap, the learning rate is the same, you know, but you've just got this 2-year gap. And I'm not sure that is so negative, in the sense that presumably it means that, you know, kids are going to hit adulthood, you know, not so far behind the typically developing peers, and that if you could therefore kind of work on them in adolescence in terms of improve, you know, I mean, I suppose what I'm really saying is there's a sense in which there's a ceiling on language, you know, learning, right, in adulthood, more or less. So the rate is going to slow down as we reach adulthood. And does that not mean that if these curves stay the same, there's going to be these kids are going to, in some sense, catch up or be much closer in adulthood than they were, you know, when they were 11? And I think you could actually make a similar point about the early instability. I mean, it seems to me there's a sense in which kids learn an awful lot more in the first 5 years than they do in the next 6. And so the reason why it's not stable in the first 5 is because there's more going on, and therefore more room for instability. So, you know, there's a sense in which what you've got is a linear curve, sort of from 5 to, you know, I don't know, 18, which basically starts to decelerate as you reach adulthood, and which is accelerating very early on. So there's, you know, there's big acceleration from 0 to 5. There's a linear curve from 5 to sort of, you know, adolescence or whatever, and then it's going to slow down again. So, you know, there's a sense in which if you can keep these kids at 2 years behind, there's going to come a point when that isn't such a big deal. Now, well, I mean, I know there's a measurement issue as well, but anyway, yes.
I think there is some truth in that, and I think the way we think about it is quite interesting. So I used to be a school governor. I used to go crazy, like at the time, you know, schools were under huge pressure for children to make greater than expected progress and to narrow these gaps. And I would say, but you can't have everybody above average. And the inspectors would say, yes, you can. I've seen it in other schools. And I would say, you can't do it. So I do think that we need to have a little bit of tolerance for variation and not expect everybody to be at the mean. And that's fine. I think the challenge is when that difference impacts kids' ability to do other things that they need to do to be successful and when it impacts their well-being, their self-esteem, their friendships, all of that kind of stuff. But that's why I think sometimes thinking not just about where you are in the distribution, but what language do you need to be able to do the things that you need to do is maybe a better way to be thinking about it. I certainly, when I talk to schools, say to prevent the gap from widening is actually amazing and really, really good work and really testament to how good our schools are. And that I think is a positive thing. So yeah, I think kind of both, but I think if you listen to Sophie Franks, you know, she clearly has challenges with language. There's clearly still really big gaps between her and her peer groups. And this has some pretty significant implications for work and for social relationships. So I think we have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, but the sense
is so important, but what it means in terms of your ability to participate in society might be.
But there is a sense in which trying to narrow the gap does tend to mean that people are kind of putting emphasis early on when, you know, they're actually, there's one implication of what you're saying really is that they probably need it later on, right?
I agree, and that is one thing. So you're absolutely right. If you look at how, in fact, in Surrey, when we were doing this, they totally reorganized the way they did speech and language therapy, and how they allocated speech and language therapy. But the offer for primary schools is about double what it is for secondary schools.
Yeah.
And I would say, why have you done that? Because they're still there in secondary school and they still need an awful lot of support. But the view is you have less potential to change in secondary school, and therefore we're not going to put the support in at that age. Whereas I think actually you can be supporting a lot of things that might yield better outcomes ultimately, even if they're not necessarily language outcomes.
Does anyone else have any questions for Courtney? Danielle, do you want to unmute yourself? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, as always. Lovely. I just wanted to get back to your measure of the SDQ. And so in the group of children who have DLD, but not low IQ, you probably said this and I missed it, but are their SDQ scores higher than the general population?
They are. We didn't, so in general, in our group, we don't have massive behavior problems. So I think certainly in year one, and we haven't looked at it in these terms lately, but about 10% of them had like clinical levels of behavior difficulties, which was about twice what the kids who didn't have language problems had. We have a paper that's gone through second round of revisions, basically showing that the relationship between language and SDQ is not linear. So, you know, it's once you get to a certain level of language, then you see this like increase in behavior difficulties. But beyond that level, your level of language doesn't really seem to make much difference at all. So it's more of a threshold thing. But again, part of that could be measurement, because SDQ isn't really sensitive across the range. It's much more looking at difficulties. So
yeah, and did you ever look at the relationship between SDQ and vocab compared to narrative comprehension?
Oh, we haven't done that kind of fine-grained detail. No, we tend to look more just at language in general. Do you think that it would have different relationships?
I don't know, just guess the narrative comprehension is a bit more pragmatic, maybe closer. I actually was kind of interested whether you saw differences across. I know that's not really what you were looking for, but do you see different patterns if you look at, seeing as you've got these different measures, do they pattern differently ever? Or?
So again, this is something that Bornstein and lots of other people have talked about. When we try and do measurement models of language, they all load on one underlying latent language factor. So we don't really see separate factors for vocabulary or grammar or vocabulary. You'll know we've been looking at pragmatic things. Again, you can separate them out, but they're really highly correlated. If you look at something like the children's communication checklist, for example. So
yeah, okay, that's really helpful, thank you.
In fact, in that SDQ paper, we started off thinking that different bits of behavior might relate to different patterns of language, but we came up against this problem that the measurement model said there's one underlying construct of language, it doesn't separate out.
That's really interesting.
I can send it to you if you want.
Please, I'd love to. Yeah, I'm going to email you after. Thank you.
Okay.
There's a question on the chat from Daphne, and she's asked if there's any research, or if there's been any research into the prevalence of DLD in homeschooled children, and specifically whether them having kind of one-to-one teaching makes any difference compared to children in, you know, a classroom of 30 people.
Such a great question. No, I don't think there is. We tried to get hold of the homeschool kids in Surrey, but I think there were only 10 families registered at the time, and trying to get hold of them was hard. Of course, one of the things I'm really interested in is how lockdown has affected kids, but that's fraught with difficulties. I think, so what would be really interesting to me is whether our stability estimates change given that children were out of school for so long. My gut feeling is probably this is going to be dwarfed by individual differences anyway, you know, but who knows? It's certainly also the case. I mean, we looked at what our kids in lockdown were getting, the 50 or so that we saw. Certainly the ones who had multiple special educational challenges were in school a lot less, or online learning a lot less than some of the other kids. So one might predict that over this period of time, stability will be less because the environment will be more variable, and what kids were getting was different. But whether, given the amount of time they were out, whether that's sufficient to disrupt this kind of what seems to be, I don't know, the stability that's there anyway, I don't know. So don't know about homeschooling. I suspect it will be very variable. Some kids will benefit a lot, some maybe less so. Also challenging because I suspect that the kinds of parents who go for homeschooling will be themselves quite different sorts of people. So you're compounding lots of interesting things there. But the short answer is I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any further questions for Courtney? Elena, could you unmute yourself?
Yeah, it was a great talk, Courtney, fantastically interesting. I just wanted to ask you about the sort of take-home message, which seems to be that we should be worrying about adolescents and their entry into life. And you said that we need to work out how to help children to integrate with their peers and to talk about and understand their emotional regulation. And I thought to myself, God, that sounds a hell of a lot more difficult than teaching them vocabulary at the age of or how to understand the passive. So I was wondering if you actually had any thoughts about, I just think about adolescent grandchildren around and nieces and nephews, and it just sounds like an almost impossible task. Are there programs to do this? Are they successful?
So that's a great question. It's something that we are very seriously thinking about in terms of what next. We've done another whole talk. You could get Sarah Griffiths to come and tell you about all the stuff we've been doing in Scales about emotion recognition and emotion regulation. We think it's a really important issue because children with language disorders are at increased risk for mental health issues. And we did a little animated video about this actually, and we had a young person with DLD talking about going to CAMS, and basically just how difficult that is, because all of our cognitive behavioral treatments are verbally mediated. They're all talking strategies, and that's tough. And when you look at, we did a study looking at temporal distancing strategies. So these are how you can use like future thinking to alleviate some of the stress that you're feeling. So one of the ways we get through lockdown is by telling ourselves, this won't be forever, in a year's time, we'll be doing something else and we won't remember it and it won't matter and blah, blah, blah. But actually for kids with language disorder, future thinking is a very tricky thing to do. They really struggle with that. They struggle with recognizing how they feel. They might know that they feel differently, but they don't have a label for what that means. And we published a paper earlier this year showing that your language skills at 5 or 6 hugely predicted your ability to just recognize facial expressions at the age of 10. So when you're approaching people, we can automatically say, oh, looks angry, maybe I need to tread carefully here. Whereas kids with language disorders don't really seem to do that. So there are lots of programs, some of them universal provisions that people have put into schools to look at emotion regulation. My daughter at their school used to do something, I think it was called zones of regulation. So they have like these color-coded stoplight type things. If you're in the red zone, here are things you need to do. If you're in the green zone, this is what that means. Again, all verbally mediated, and we have I don't think anybody looks at whether language is a factor and how well children respond to that kind of treatment. And I don't know of many studies that look at applying those treatments to groups of children with and without language disorder. There have been a couple of studies that have looked at the impact early on of a language intervention on children's behavior, but they're very small studies. So it does sound very challenging to me, and we have almost no evidence one way or another. So to me, that's like a really important area that research needs to tackle, particularly given the numbers of kids who are ending up in CAMS who have significant language difficulties and can't access the interventions that are on offer.
Courtney, that raises a much wider theoretical issue, which I think is very interesting and might be worth somebody thinking about, which is the influence of language on thought. And but what you're saying is that language is actually infecting cognitive emotional categories to the point where people, if they haven't got the language for the categories, they haven't got the appropriate behavior. Well, that just feeds straight into the whole Whorfian issue about the relationship between language and thought. So you might find that this area that you're working in will kind of not only deal with issues of how you talk about growth, but more generally, but also this whole issue of language, the relationship of language to kind of internal cognitive structure. I hadn't thought about that, but it
has been really interesting. So the emotion regulation task we had was, we had all these little scenarios, and we asked kids, there were different conditions. So they'd hear a scenario like your friends talking about you behind your back, and then they were either prompted to just respond as they would today, or to imagine the future. So how would you feel about this next week? How would you feel about this many years from now? And we had some really interesting, it was a hard task. There were lots of kids with language disorder who just couldn't do it at all. But when we talked to them, they said really, really interesting things. So I remember one kid saying, well, I would just be happy because I'm always happy. I'm always happy. And of course, that's not true. But they just didn't seem to be able to think about anything other than the way they were feeling at that moment in time. And others would say, well, I can't imagine the future. Like, I don't know what it will be like next year or 5 years from now, because I just I can't imagine what things will be like. And I just thought, wow, that would, I mean, there's a sense in which we always want to say live in the present, but to not be able to think about the future at all is actually really worrying. And, you know, we need to be able to think about the future, not only for our well-being, but in order to make plans and to have a strategy for what we're going to do next. So to me, that was like, you know, really a very interesting moment where they were like, well, future thinking, that's a hard thing. And if you have strategies that rely on thinking about hypotheticals, that's tricky and probably contributes to things like reading comprehension. I mean, all of that is about hypothetical worlds, right? If you can't imagine them or use language to think about yourself in different situations, then that has very broad implications, I think.
Absolutely, thanks.
All right, does anyone else have anything else they'd like to ask? No, I think that's you done then, Courtney. Thank you so much for such an excellent talk and a really good discussion afterwards.
Yeah, really good discussion. Really lovely to see you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll just give a quick announcement about our next seminar, which is in January, on the 12th of January 2021. I don't know when that happened. And it's going to be Larry Leonard from Purdue. So that one will be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just because of the time difference. And he'll be talking about retrieval-based word learning in children with DLD. But I'll send round the details of that after this talk, and also the recording to this talk as well. So thank you again, Courtney, and I hope you all have a lovely Christmas.
Take care, everyone. Bye.